Some children are born in silence, some in candlelight, and some are born beneath banners of gold. You were born into a throne, but you didn't know that yet. Before you could speak, servants bowed before you. Before you could walk, men argued over what your name should mean. Before you opened your eyes, the empire was already watching. You didn't choose this life. It was chosen around you. Woven into every breath you took, you were not just a baby. You were a future, a symbol, a vessel for the mandate of heaven. The room where you slept, silent, perfumed, filled with soft shadows, was also a battlefield, but you didn't see the battles. You only saw colors. There were no lullabies. Instead, there were rituals. An official named the Master of Etiquette supervised your feeding schedule. Another tracked your first cough and reported it to the palace physician. When you cried, a eunuch made a note. When you smiled, a scholar wrote a poem. You were swaddled not in love, but in protocol. The palace was filled with women who fed you, washed you, changed your silk robes. But none of them were your mother. Your real mother was somewhere else, treated more like a political title than a parent. She would see you on schedule, like a minister, like a ceremony, not like a mother. At your naming ceremony, you were carried into a great hall, too young to speak, too small to understand. But already the adults around you knelt on their knees, foreheads to the cold stone floor, not because they loved you, not because they knew you, but because you were now the emperor's son, and perhaps the emperor himself. The scrolls that named you used words like heaven's hope, golden child, lord of 10,000 years. You couldn't even hold a spoon. But your tiny hands now held a nation. From the beginning, you were never alone. But you were always lonely. Guards stood at your doors. Tutors watched from the corners. Eunuchs whispered your activities into notebooks each night. When you babbled nonsense, they called it divine. When you laughed, they wrote it down as an omen. Even your silence meant something. You were raised under watchful eyes, but none of them were yours. No one asked what you liked. No one cared what you dreamed of, because you were not a boy. You were a future emperor. And emperors don't dream. Your first words were spoken in a language of ceremony. Your first walk was measured by ministers. No scraped knees, no muddy feet, only red carpets and rules. When a butterfly landed on your sleeve one spring morning, you giggled. A guard killed it and apologized, because in your world, even beauty had no permission. At night, you sometimes woke to the sound of nothing, a kind of emptiness that echoed deeper than silence. And in that silence, you wondered, what is this place? Why do they bow? Who am I really? The answer would take years to form. But even then, you might not believe it. Because when you are born to rule, before you are even old enough to speak, you learn power, before you learn love. And that kind of childhood doesn't go away, even when you grow old. In the next chapter, you'll meet the people who raised you. Not your mother, not your father, but the silent ones, the watchers, the writers, the men who smiled too politely, never left your side. Before you learned to walk, you were already under the eyes of men who walked without sound. Before your first tooth came in, a council of officials had already discussed what your handwriting should look like when you turned 6. You were a child, but you were not raised like other children. You were raised by eunuchs men, without families, men without futures of their own, and by regents noblemen who ruled on your behalf. While you played with carved jade animals in the garden, you were watched. Every moment you were obeyed, but never understood. You were feared, but never held. Eunuchs were trusted with everything. They bathed you, they fed you. They dressed you in golden robes and lifted your arms so you could pretend to wave to ambassadors. Their eyes scanned each room, not for comfort, but for danger. They smiled without joy. They knew the politics of your cries. If you cried at the wrong time in front of the wrong guest, they knew the court might whisper that you were unfit, so they calmed you with stories, not fairy tales, but fables of old emperors, clever foxes, and virtuous punishments. They told you what not to say. They told you who not to trust. And they always knelt lower than you, even when you were 2, even when you couldn't pronounce their names. You didn't know it then. But while you played with ivory chess pieces and toy horses carved from sandalwood, regents met behind lacquered doors to decide the fate of provinces. They used your name to pass laws. They used your seal to remove ministers. They used your silence to control the empire. Sometimes you would catch a glimpse of one. A shadowed face bowing deeply. A gloved hand placing scrolls on your table. A whisper of your majesty agrees before you even understood the question. You were their symbol. They were your voice. And in that arrangement, they thrived. Your tutor never told you his real name. He taught you to read with bamboo strips and ink made from pine soot. He corrected your brushwork with gentle taps. He praised your recitation of the Book of Rites. But when you asked why your father was never there, he looked away and pointed to a passage about obedience. He didn't answer your questions, only reminded you that one day you would give the answers. And when that day came, you must not hesitate. But you hesitated already. When the birds flew too close to your balcony, you wanted to ask their names. When the eunuchs looked tired, you wanted to tell them they could rest. When your servants flinched, you wanted to say sorry. But emperors don't say sorry, even when they are 4 years old. The palace was beautiful, but it was cold. Not from the weather, but from the distance. No one called you by a nickname. No one messed up your hair. No one chased you around the garden in laughter. When you were sick, 10 physicians arrived. Each took notes. Each waited for the others to speak first. They didn't ask how you felt. They read your pulse like a scroll. And when you sneezed, they all bowed. Not out of kindness, but because protocol demanded it. On your 5th birthday, they brought a throne just your size. Carved from sandalwood, inlaid with pearl and gold. They placed a tiny crown on your head, too heavy. It hurt your neck. They told you to sit still. They told you to look regal. They told you not to fidget. You looked around at the hall full of kneeling men. You asked, "Can I go play now?" Someone laughed. A eunuch scolded them. You weren't supposed to sound like a child, but you were one. And you always would be. Even when they called you emperor, you grew older in years. But the rules never aged. The walls never softened. You were raised not to lead, but to appear as though you were leading. And in the quiet of the night, when the fire burned low, you wondered, who are these men who raise me? Who are these voices that decide the world in my name? And when will I finally be allowed to choose? Anything in the next chapter. You will learn what they taught you, what they made you memorize, what they made you believe, even if it meant losing yourself in the process. Next, Chapter 3. Education for a God King. You woke before the sun. The first lesson of the day was to wake when the empire wakes. Even though you were still a child, a very tired child, you were expected to rise, not with the birds, but before them. The palace sky was still gray.
Ow.
The floor cold beneath your embroidered slippers. Eunuch helped you into your morning robe. Silk, always silk, and walked beside you in silence. Down the corridors of stone and stillness, toward the study hall, the room smelled of ink and age. The shelves were endless, bamboo scrolls, silk scrolls, clay rubbings, bone etchings. Your first lesson each morning was memorization, passages from the Book of Rites, proverbs from Confucius, lists of dynasties, their founders, their sins, their downfall. Your tutor's voice was calm but without warmth. You would read a line, you repeated it again and again, until the words lost meaning, until there were no longer lessons, but commandments. What you learned was not how to think, but how to obey. In the afternoons, the real lessons began. Lessons not written in scrolls. Lessons whispered. A eunuch would quietly inform you what words were no longer to be used at court. A change in political winds. An official had fallen from favor. A name was now forbidden. You learned the language of survival, how to talk without speaking, how to show loyalty without truth, how to lie with a bow. You became fluent in silence. You were taught how to stand, how to walk, how to lower your eyes just enough to suggest humility, but not so much that you looked weak. You practiced bowing, not too fast, not too slow. You learned how to hold a brush as if it were a sword, because in the palace, words could kill. One misplaced character in a proclamation could start a rebellion. One careless signature could end a man's life. You were taught to speak with caution, but also to speak with finality. Even when you didn't understand what you were saying, you were quizzed endlessly on past emperors, their virtues, their failures. You knew which one built canals, Which one drowned concubines? Which one vanished during a storm and was never seen again? Each lesson came with a warning. Do not be like him. Be better than her. Remember what happened to those who ignored heaven's signs? You studied their mistakes like maps. And yet, no one could teach you how to be yourself. Only how to be a better version of someone already dead. Your brushstrokes were compared to ancient masters, your pronunciation to that of long-gone sages, your posture measured against statues. And when you stumbled, when you yawned, when you asked a question that wasn't in the scrolls, your tutor would pause, he would sigh, and mark it down. Every mistake was noted, not because it mattered now, but because one day, the historians would need something to say. They would want to know. Did the boy emperor seem lazy? Did he ask too many questions? Was he too soft? History is written slowly. And you were already being edited, or things you were never taught. How to laugh loudly, how to run without guards, how to make a friend without checking their rank. No one told you how to trust, or how to know when someone truly meant what they said. You knew math, poetry, rituals, and statecraft. But you didn't know how to cry in front of others, so you learned to cry alone, silently, behind golden curtains. Because there was so much they wanted you to become, and none of it was a child. Your playground was a marble courtyard, and the entire palace became your stage. In the next chapter, you'll explore the moments in between, when your classroom was a throne room. Every child has a place where imagination takes over, a hiding spot, a swing, a patch of sunlit floor. For most children, it's a corner of freedom. For you, it was the throne room. It's not a playground by design, but by necessity, because there was nowhere else. The Hall of Supreme Harmony was larger than anything your eyes could hold. Red columns stretched upward like forests of lacquered flame. The dragons etched in gold above you seemed to move when the light changed. You knew this room was meant to inspire awe, to intimidate, to frame the emperor as more than mortal, but to you, it was an empty hall with fascinating echoes. You would run between pillars while no one watched, would whisper to the throne as if it could whisper back. You pretended the dragons were listening. When court was not in session, the hall felt abandoned, too big to still. That was when you played. You crawled behind silk drapes, hid under the steps, balanced on the black stones in the courtyard, as if they were islands in a stormy sea. A small boy in a too large robe, playing in the most sacred space of the realm. Once, you used the emperor's seal as a stamp on your drawings. The eunuchs were horrified. You didn't understand why. You weren't trying to rule. We're just trying to make something your own. You gave names to the stone lions. You gave voices to the painted ceiling gods. You invented stories. The phoenix in the roof tiles was your secret messenger. The jade turtles knew your dreams because there were no real friends, no children. No one your age allowed within 100 meters. So you imagined. You created a court of invisible companions. More loyal, more playful, more forgiving than anyone you knew. Even in your pretend world, rules followed you. You could not laugh too loudly. You could not run where others might see. Could not touch the sacred symbols, even when you were the symbol they were sacred to. Once a guard caught you scribbling over a map of the empire. He didn't shout. He just looked at you, like you were already disappointing. You didn't understand. You only wanted to draw the mountains taller. You only wanted to make the rivers curve like dragons. But you were told the map is perfect. Because you are perfect. Even when you weren't. Eventually, the games faded. You learned where not to wander. You stopped talking to statues. The throne stopped being a mountain to climb. It became a place you sat, motionless, while ministers bowed and scribes recorded. They told you when to nod. They whispered what to say. They reminded you when to blink. You weren't playing anymore. You were performing, and the performance never ended. Even when no one clapped. Even when you didn't know what the script meant. There were moments of laughter. There were echoes of joy. Each was weighed, measured, observed. Your childhood lived in the shadows of pillars, and your innocence echoed through a chamber meant for power. In the next chapter, you will meet the people closest to you, the ones who entered your private quarters, who whispered through walls, who said they loved you, and the ones who meant to control you through something far more powerful than law, affection. Next, Chapter 5. the spy who loved no one. There was always someone nearby. There was always someone in the corner, smiling, silent. Still, you were told he was there to protect you, to serve you, to ensure your comfort. But even as a child, you could feel it. He wasn't watching for you. He was watching you. He stood a few paces behind your door. He bowed when you passed. He kept a perfect distance at meals, at lessons during your play. And yet he never looked away. You didn't know his name. He was just there. Sometimes with a scroll, sometimes with a fan, sometimes just watching. When you dropped a spoon, he noted it. When you woke crying from a dream, you found him already awake. The fire in the hearth never went out, because he kept it burning, but not for warmth. For record, he said he was loyal. He had served your father, and your father's father. He had no family, no wealth, no ambition, only his duty. But loyalty was not affection. He never smiled unless someone else was watching. He never touched your shoulder, never called you by a name, only titles. When you cried, he stood still. When you laughed, he did not. He was a statue that moved, shadow that breathed. Sometimes late at night, you heard him speak, not to you, but to someone on the other side of the curtain, a low murmur, quick words, names. You asked him once who he was speaking to. He said the minister of records you didn't understand. You were 6. He said it again. Every moment matters. And that was when you began to notice what he noticed. When you hesitated before answering a question, he blinked. When you lingered near a forbidden scroll, he shifted. Your whole life was being written. Your chambers were quiet, but never private. Curtains were thick, but not soundproof. Walls were carved, but not sealed. Servants whispered behind fans. Guards stood beyond the painted screens. One afternoon, you shouted at a servant. You regretted it instantly. Apologized. By evening, your regent arrived to discuss your mood. The spy had reported it, kindly, calmly, officially, not to punish you, but to correct you. Even your regrets had witnesses. Even your feelings had footnotes. He once told you a story, just one, about a crane that waited 100 years for its mate. You were tired. You wanted comfort. You leaned your head against his arm. He did not move. He did not push you away, but he also did not lean back. He simply let you rest. The next day, you found the story written in your lesson book. It had become a parable, its meaning explained. Your feelings, annotated. The spy never raised his voice, never struck you, never shamed you, but you feared him, not because of what he might do, but because of what he already knew. Every small rebellion, every misstep, every wish spoken too loudly. You tried once to test him. You pretended to lose something, a jade ring gifted to you by your mother. You wanted to see if he would lie. You wanted to see if he would panic. He did neither. He returned the ring before you asked. And later, the regent reminded you that your mother's gifts should not be misplaced. Even your games were not yours. He never left, not truly. When you learned to speak, he was there. When you learned to sign decrees, he was there. And one day, when you would become an adult emperor, he would no longer be behind you, because he would be inside you. His silence, his gaze, his judgment would carry it all with you, forever. In the next chapter, you will feel what he tried to protect you from. You will feel the weight of power, the isolation of youth, and the walls begin to close. Even as the empire outside demands your strength. Inside, you are still a boy, still waiting for someone to see you. Next, Chapter 6. The mask cracks. There is a moment in every child emperor's life when the mask begins to slip. Not in public, not before the ministers, or generals, or scribes, but in private. In that quiet hour before dawn, when the air is cold, and you realize you are not who they think you are only pretending to be. And the pretending is starting to hurt. You had practiced that smile 1,000 times. The polite one, the imperial one. You knew when to show it. When ambassadors arrived. When paintings were unveiled. When your tutor read a poem that was supposed to be clever. But now, you catch yourself doing it even when you're alone. Even when the room is empty. Even when your thoughts are dark. You smile, because you've forgotten what else to do. The mask is now your face. The palace was made to last forever. But you began to notice the cracks in the tiles, and the walls, and the people. A regent's hand trembled as he poured tea. A eunuch forgot a line of ritual. A page boy stammered in your presence and was never seen again. You watched it all, not with fear, not with amusement, but with a strange growing distance, as if you were no longer inside your life, but floating just above it, watching the role of emperor being performed by someone wearing your robes. Why are the halls always cold? Why can't I go beyond the inner court? Why do the ministers speak to me like I'm still a child, yet blame me like I'm a man? Your questions do not get answers. It's only new versions of the same proverbs. Heaven watches. Silence is strength. The emperor is a mirror to the world. But what if the mirror is cracked? What if no one is really watching? What if you scream and the heavens remain silent? You step where you were told not to. You open a scroll meant only for ministers. You tear a page. You wait for the consequences. You arrive in the form of silence. Not punishment, not correction, just eyes, watching you from behind screens. Recording it, passing it up the chain, you don't get scolded. You get studied, and that's worse, because you don't know what story they're writing about you. It was a small thing, a simple decree about irrigation. They handed it to you pre-written, polished, and for the first time you said, no. The air changed. The scribe's brush stopped moving. A eunuch's throat clicked. You didn't explain why. Didn't have to. You just said no, and they obeyed. But later that evening, you were visited by the regent. He was calm, smiling, kind, and he told you a story about a boy emperor who overstepped. The next morning, your food was served by different hands. Your tutor was replaced. The scroll was signed anyway. Not rebellion, not war. Death. Just running. You dream of climbing over the palace wall. You dream of walking through a village with no titles, of hearing someone call your name, your real name with no bow attached to it. You imagine wind on your face, dust on your boots, laughter that doesn't need permission. But you never tell anyone this dream because it would be treason. To want a different life is to betray the one they gave you, even if that life was never really yours. There is a bronze mirror in your sleeping quarters, polished daily. Its face never forgets. Some nights, you stare into it. For minutes. For hours. You try to see the emperor they say you are. Try to see the boy you used to be. But all you see is something in between. It's not a ruler, not a child. Just a mask, with eyes that blink. And you wonder, when did the pretending begin? And will it ever end? The mask does not break in one day. It bends, it cracks, and eventually, it no longer fits. In the next chapter, you will learn what happens when you try to take it off. When you demand to rule on your own terms. When the child tries to become the emperor, they were always told they already were. And what happens? When those around you decide the mask must never fall? Next, Chapter 7, The Tiger Throne. They called it the Dragon Throne. But to you, it felt more like a tiger, coiled, silent, waiting, a thing of beauty. Carved from sacred wood, raised high on its marble platform, its curves golden, its edges sharp. You had sat on it since you were small, but now it felt different, alive, watching you. There was no ceremony that day. No audience, no drums or processions. Just a whisper from the regent. It's time. He stepped back, and you stepped forward. The throne loomed above you, steps polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. You climbed them like a mountain. Not quickly, not joyfully, but with the weight of a child who had waited too long to be heard, and was now unsure if he still wanted to speak. You sat, and for a moment, the hall was utterly still. You expected something to change. A feeling, a revelation, a power, but all you felt was cold. The tiger beneath you had not moved. It was only watching. You began to notice the shifts. Ministers bowed deeper. Eunuchs spoke less. Guards flinched when you cleared your throat. The air grew heavier around you, not because you had grown stronger, but because they had grown more afraid. You saw it in their eyes. Not respect. Not devotion. Calculation. They weighed each word, measured every expression, plotted how to guide your reign while pretending to obey it. They were no longer raising you. They were managing you. One day during court, a general complained about lack of supplies. You interrupted. You asked where the money had gone? The hall went quiet. Too quiet. The general blinked. The scribes paused. The regent smiled, but did not meet your gaze. Later, that general was reassigned. The regent called it a coincidence. But you knew. You had drawn blood, even if only by accident. And the throne beneath you purred, not with satisfaction, but with hunger. You begin to notice what happens when you speak. Your words cause ripples, tremors, fear. So you experiment. A frown, a sigh, a nod. Each one becomes a tool. Each one shifts something. You don't understand every reaction, but you see them, and that is enough. The tiger approves. Not because you're wise, not because you're kind, but because you've learned to move with caution, to strike without standing. It was about rice, a famine in the south. You insisted that grain be diverted from the imperial stores. The ministers protested. The treasury would shrink. The precedent would be dangerous. You did not argue. You simply signed the scroll. Your handwriting was shaky, but your hand did not tremble. The next day a eunuch told you, the people have heard. They are grateful, and for the first time. Not power, not glory, but connection. Someone out there had heard your voice, and the tiger was quiet. It didn't happen all at once, but the more you sat, the more you listened, the less you spoke. Not out of fear, but out of strategy, because you learned. When you say less, they say more. When you appear uncertain, they reveal their agendas. You watched the regents, the advisors, the generals, and in silence, you gathered your army, not of soldiers, but of truths. The throne sharpened your instincts, like claws beneath velvet. With each day, something left you. A softness, question, a dream. You no longer imagined escape. You no longer smiled without purpose. Even your voice began to change, measured, heavy, precise. The boy who once played beneath the pillars was gone, and the tiger smiled. Because the game was almost over, you were no longer wearing the mask. You had become it. The throne is never empty. Even when no one sits upon it, it waits, it watches. And now, it has chosen you. In the next chapter, you will face your greatest challenge. Not an enemy, not a war, but a decision. Who will you become when the mask fits too well to remove, and who will suffer if you finally try? Next, Chapter 8. The Decision Room. There is a room in the Forbidden City that most never see. Its walls are bare, its windows narrow, its ceiling low, not in height but in feeling. It is where decisions are made, not declarations, not performances, not ceremonies, but real decisions. Quiet ones, lonely ones. And one day, you are led there. Not as a student, not as a child, but as an emperor. The door shuts behind you, heavily, deliberately. You are alone. For the first time in years, no regent, no advisor, no smiling eunuch. Just a desk, a single stool, stack of scrolls sealed in red wax. Each scroll, a decision. Each seal, a life. You are expected to read them. You are expected to understand them. You are expected to choose. There is no one to guide you here, because here, your choice must be your own. The silence is thick, and the walls don't echo. Because the decision room was built to keep secrets. You unwrap the first scroll. It's a border dispute. Two governors accusing each other of theft. One has family in the palace, the other support in the army. Who do you believe? What evidence do you trust? You weren't taught this. They trained you in calligraphy and Confucian verse, but not in choosing who to punish when both men bow. You read it again, slower, looking for clarity, looking for a sign. There is none. You make a choice anyway. You sign your name. You seal thumbs down. You feel nothing at first, just your pulse. In your fingertips. And in some faraway province. A man's future just ended. Another scroll. Then another. Punishments. Appointments. Edicts. You begin to see patterns. The same names appear. The same officials ask for more land, more power. They're circling, testing, watching what kind of emperor you will be. If you feel their fingers pressing through paper, trying to twist your hand before it even moves. But they forget. You are no longer a child. You have learned how to read not just words, but intentions. So, you start writing your own scrolls. Not with flourish, not with rage, but with certainty. The decision room becomes a weapon, and your signature. A blade. Then comes the scroll you weren't ready for. A young woman, accused of treason, the daughter of a former minister. You remember her name? You once saw her across a courtyard. She bowed to you, but did not look away. She smiled. A real smile. Now they say she conspired against you. The evidence is unclear. But the request is clear. Execution. You hold the scroll. Too long. The room doesn't breathe. And for a moment, neither do you. You think of mercy. You think of risk. You think of precedent. And then, for the first time in your reign, you ask for the scroll to be returned. Unmarked. And the next day, no one speaks of it. No one mentions her again. She vanishes, like a cloud erased from a painting. They told you the throne would be heavy, but they didn't tell you where it would weigh. It's not on your shoulders, not on your hands. It presses against your thoughts, against your nights, against your dreams. You dream of scrolls with no writing, of seals that won't stick, of people you've never met, kneeling before you, weeping. You wake up drenched in sweat, but still, when the morning bell rings, you return to the decision room because there's no one else who can, because there's no one else who will. Power is not glory. It is responsibility. It is silence. It is choosing the lesser cruelty when no kindness is allowed. And it is the realization that each choice you make will live longer than you do. In the next chapter, you will face a mirror more terrifying than any bronze or glass. You'll face the people. And you will learn what it means to be seen, not as a boy, not as a mask, not even as an emperor, but as a symbol. And what happens when that symbol begins to fracture. Next, Chapter 9. The People's Emperor. The throne made you an emperor. The regents made you a ruler. The decision room made you a judge. But the people, they would make you real, or they would unmake you. It was spring. The peach blossoms had just begun to open. The eunuchs had prepared your ceremonial robe for days. Golden thread, crimson silk, stitched dragons too ornate to touch. But that morning, you chose something simpler, still imperial, but not distant. You walked without a litter, no trumpets, no horses, no entourage large enough to blot out the sky, just guards at a distance, and your own feet touching the ground. People saw you. And for a moment they didn't cheer, they stared, not in fear but in confusion. Because emperors do not walk alone, and emperors do not look back when children wave. His hands were covered in red clay. He bowed, unsure. You asked him what he was shaping. Said a bowl, your majesty. You asked who it was for. Said anyone who's hungry. You didn't know what to say. You'd expected fear, or praise, or poetry. Instead, you got truth. And for the first time you realized the people do not see you as a god. They see you as a man who could help, or hurt, or ignore. You nodded. And for reasons you could not explain, you felt ashamed. You visited the floodplain months later. The irrigation reforms had been signed by your own hand. Now you wanted to see the fields. They smelled of water and sweat. A woman, her feet thick with mud, handed you a grain stalk, she said. Last year we starved. This year we will eat. No ceremony, no kneeling, no flattery. Just a fact. It was the greatest praise you had ever received. And it burned. Because no one had told you they were starving before. No one had dared to say the words. But here the truth grew in the open, and now that you had seen it, could never again rule as if you hadn't. It began with letters. Simple ones. Not through ministers. Not through rituals. Sent by old women, by orphans, by monks. Some were scrawled on scraps. Some were calligraphy worthy of the court. They asked for grain, for justice, for roads, for mercy. You read every one, not because it was required, but because you now knew. This was the empire. Not the throne room, not the regent's whisper. Not the carved dragons above your head, but the voices that no one had wanted you to hear. Now you couldn't stop listening. They called it dangerous, too accessible, too informal. They told you emperors must not lower themselves. They must inspire awe. But awe, you realized, is not the same as respect. Distance is not the same as strength. You reminded them. The people bowed not to gold or cloth, but to justice. And if you forgot that, you deserved nothing. You started sending responses. Brief, direct, handwritten. One to a widow whose home had burned. One to a soldier's mother. One to a boy who asked if the stars above the palace were the same as his. You told him, yes, but mine are harder to see. In tea shops, in temples, in alleys and open squares. They began telling stories of how you visited the fields, of how you sat among workers, of how you answered letters. Some were true, some were not, but it didn't matter, because stories are what make rulers into symbols, and you had finally become one worth telling. Not because you were flawless, not because you were feared, but because you listened, and in listening, you had made them believe again. Not in the throne, but in the one who sat upon it. In the final chapter, the mask will fall away. The boy, the emperor, the burden. And you will come face to face with yourself, not as a symbol, not as a ruler, but as a man. One who is loved, ruled, failed, and remembered. And who must now prepare for what no one ever taught you. How to say goodbye. Next, Chapter 10. The Emperor Alone. This is the final chamber, the final lesson. There are no tutors here, no scrolls, no ministers waiting for your command. It's only silence and the sound of your own breath. This is where emperors go, to remember who they were, dare, and to prepare for who they must become. Your face still appears on banners. Your name is still inked on edicts. Your signature still changes lives. But your body grows thinner. Your steps slower, your voice quieter. No one says the word, not yet, but they all know. The emperor is leaving. You walk the gardens. They feel vast, as if the walls have pulled farther apart. You pass by your childhood study, still full of scrolls, still bathed in morning light. You stop, you sit, and you let yourself remember the boy who sat here once, who recited poems without knowing why, who dreamed of riding horses, of touching snow, of sleeping in late. You do not cry, but you feel something drift through you, like a window has opened, and something has just stepped out. Every emperor writes one, a letter for the next, not a will, not a proclamation, a letter. You begin. To the one who wears the robe after me. You tell them what no one told you. You tell them to trust their silence. You tell them not to fear mercy. You tell them that the throne is a mask, but only a mask, and it must never be mistaken for the face. You stop. You wait. And then you write one more line. You are not alone, and you sign your name. But not as emperor, as yourself. The final evening comes quietly. No announcements. No rituals. You dismiss the guards. You wear no crown. No dragon robe. You walk alone through the corridors, past the reflecting pools. You stop beneath the stars, and for the first time, you feel the sky without the weight of it pressing down. You breathe. It does not hurt. You look into the old bronze mirror. It's the same one from your childhood. You see the lines around your eyes, the calm in your jaw, the quiet strength. You do not see a god. You do not see a legend. You see a man who ruled, who tried, who changed, who listened. The boy emperor is gone. The mask is gone. The myth will remain. But the man, the one who walked the fields, who held the scrolls, who learned to be kind in a world that punished kindness, that man will never be forgotten. Not by the people, not by history. And perhaps, if the stars are listening, not even by heaven.